All right, so I'm going to talk about chapter 6, which is African Americans from segregation to modern racism and institutional discrimination. This year segregation. This is something that had no set end date. It was something that just ended gradually. So what helped this was urbanization and industrialization. So we get the things such as machinery and farming, which really helped minorities leave the South and migrate north, which allowed them to pursue other life tracks and make registering to vote a lot easier. And then we also see the Democratic Party realizes this and adopts a civil rights party platform, which is a step in the right direction. And then we also see that for wartime developments, Roosevelt creates an executive order that bans discrimination in defense-related industries, essentially allowing for people of color to go to war. We also see the civil rights movement, which is a campaign to end segregation. And the most common known thing about this, besides Martin Luther King and his movement, is Brown v. Board, which basically reverses Plessy versus Ferguson and states that racially separated facilities are unconstitutional. This leads to a nonviolent direct action protest, which means that racially dominant groups must now open their schools up freely to everyone. And we also see the Civil Rights Act of 1964 due to the Civil Rights Movement, which bans discrimination in public places. So essentially places like parks that get federal aid are now equal to everyone. So we have Voting Rights Act of 1965, which means that all people are registered to vote the same way. No more literacy tests, and no more not allowing to register to vote because of their skin color. Just more prosperity, increased resources in the African American communities, and an increase in urbanization. We also get the Black Power movement, which is entirely different than the Civil Rights movement. So we'll start with de facto segregation, which is segregation resulting from people's choices over personal preferences. It's something that's intentional, but it's very much in disguise. So things like housing, education, and employment were heavily discriminated against people of color. And then this creates urban unrest, which was that people became upset at the amount of African American neighborhoods and riots began, which in turn created the Black Power movement, which is a loose coalition of organizations and spokespeople that essentially want to create a separate economic control for African Americans in order to stop the urban unrest. This ended pretty quick though, because there was a lot of violent actions back to them from police and FBI, and most of the leaders are now dead, in jail, or in exile. Issues and trends that we continue to see is widespread institutional discrimination. So for example, the 13,000 African American farmers versus the U.S. Department of Agriculture. This occurred because African American farmers were not getting loans for their farming supplies. And the approval took about 3 times longer than it would for a white person to get the same loan. And often the USDA would over supervise people of color before allowing them to pull the money from the bank to get their farming supplies. We also see police brutality increase. For example, Ferguson, Missouri is one of those places that this is super bad. With the shooting of Michael Brown, they left his body in the street for people to just look at and lay in the heat all day, and then they didn't even notify his family. And so the Department of Justice did an investigation into Ferguson and found that there was a large practice of unlawful conduct here. And then we also see the Proposition 14, which was a really short-lived law in California that stated that white landlords could discriminate against people of color and not allow them to have housing. The criminal justice system as well, super biased towards people of color. There's high rates of African American juvenile arrests. So young African American males make up 16% of young people, but account for 28% of juvenile arrests, with 58% being sent to adult prison, which is a really large number of people. It's about 700 arrests per 1,000 African Americans in comparison to 200 per 1,000 white people. There's also racial profiling, which is essentially that police use race as an indicator when calculating whether a person is suspicious or dangerous. It's a form of discrimination, as police tend to focus more on African Americans, which instills like a sense of fear towards those being in question. And then we also get the war on drugs. There is just an increase in arrests and prison sentences towards African American communities, because this is where you see most of the drug usage and drug dealing. It also heightened racial discrimination and racial profiling. Class inequality, it basically states that there has never been class equality because of the American economy, which essentially just wiped out when it even started to be created for African American communities. And then there is the urban underclass, which just states that African Americans and minority groups of color are marginalized and separated from the economic mainstream, which in turn creates concentrated neighborhoods of poverty. Institutional discrimination is super, super common still. We can look at big corporate companies. So a person who is white could apply to the same job as a person of color. And if they ask your race on the application, most of the time the person of color will not be considered because of their race, and therefore the white candidate is chosen more often. And that's just the gist of institutional discrimination. In the culture of poverty, we tend to concentrate poverty in certain neighborhoods, and those neighborhoods tend to consist of minorities. This is just, the neighborhoods have continued to grow and become more poverty dense since they started in like the 60s. Personal experiences, the riots during COVID because of increased police brutality. I partook in them. I thought that the protests were a great idea to push for equality. And then I'm studying the criminal justice system. So I see that there's an increased discrimination and inequality towards minorities in things such as the prison system and judge sentencings. And most of the time, people of color tend to get longer sentences and worse sentences than people who are white. We just need to study more modern day discrimination in order to get the right answer and how to stop this. I also think that we need to research neighborhoods and see if that there is still discrimination occurring towards people of color, in which there might be a cause towards more homelessness, more poverty, dense ridden neighborhoods. I think that racial discrimination is what's caused such a large gap between ever reaching equality. And I personally think that we need to get rid of the old people who were raised in segregational time periods, because they tend to be the ones who are in control, who have the power, when in reality, the younger people of our generation are the people who should be in control and who should be pushing for equality. I also learned that while reading this chapter, that racial discrimination is at an all-time high. It's just more subtle than it used to be. Other than that, that's the gist of chapter 6. If you have any questions, just let me know.